So I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our third Cambridge Disinformation Summit webinar. Today we're going to talk about the process and impact of media fact-checking, and I'll introduce our guest in a moment. I'm Alan Jagelonzer. I'm the professor of financial accounting. I'm also the head of the accounting faculty group and the co-director for the Cambridge Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability at the Judge Business School. I'm joined by John Ambler, who is one of our MBA candidates in the University of Cambridge Judge Business School. And he has a lot of interest in this disinformation, and he's been supporting the Summit series and the Summit Live that we're going to host in 2023. I'm also joined by my colleague, Mark Durand, who's a professor of organizational ethnography, also a fellow of Darwin College, and does some of the most interesting research I've seen, including immersing in Iraq, I believe, with combat doctors for several weeks. And he's got a book about that I highly recommend you read. The summit is designed and hosted by a whole host of organizations, including the Journal of Financial Reporting, the Notre Dame Center for Accounting Research and Education, and the Cambridge Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability, University of Zurich, and other institutions. We're trying to get a monthly series to get people from outside of our field, being business and accounting, to help us do interdisciplinary work and learning around disinformation, including the incentives, use, impact, and the efficacy of mitigation efforts. And in this context of mitigation, we've introduced and asked Kate Wilkinson to join us. Kate is the deputy chief editor from FactChecking. She's been working on education, immigration, crime, and viral social media hoaxes. And she also works with training African journalists on verification and research techniques. And I reached out to her several months ago because I'm fascinated by this fact-checking business. It seems to me like it's an analog to audit in my field. And so I wanted to kind of get a feel for how they view this, what their role is, and how they approach this. And we have a whole host of questions. For the audience, feel free to throw questions at us in the Q&A box, and we'll try to cycle them through as we go. It's my pleasure to introduce Kate, and I appreciate you joining us, Kate. And I wanted to ask if you would start us off tell us a little bit more about the work you do for FactChecking and how you got involved with that, please.
Yeah, so I am currently the organization's deputy chief editor. So I work under our chief editor, Liam Wheaty, and we broadly oversee editorial work in our English language websites. So we have 3 country offices which produce English language fact-checking. That's South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. And then we have another team working out of Senegal, which produces fact-checking content in French. And if you think about the map in Africa, you'll see that roughly those country offices cover or are located in regions so that we can cover the corners of the continent and try to stay plugged into important debates and claims that need to be verified that are at the sort of the basis of public debate. So I have a team in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is a group of researchers. And along with them, we monitor what is being spoken about in South Africa and in Southern Africa. We identify important debates. We select claims to fact check. We do that work. We publish fact checks. We talk about our work. But then I also oversee a number of other projects. I'm sure we can get into that later. One of them is our fact checking on WhatsApp, which has increasingly become more important because of the nature of the platform and the very limited analytics that you can get from work that you do on the platform because of its encrypted nature. So we have a podcast that is distributed as a voice note every 2 weeks called What's Crap on WhatsApp. And then I also oversee our involvement in a project that is funded by google.org to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to radically scale fact checkers' work, make it faster, more efficient, and also have more impact.
Great, thank you. I wonder if we could just start at a high level and talk about how you guys define success in your field. It feels like there's a proliferation of disinformation and it's accelerating and it's adaptable. So how do you see success in the field of fact-checking?
So I think that's an interesting question because it sort of gets to the heart of what fact-checking is. And sometimes fact-checking can have a bit of an identity crisis. And that's because fact-checking as a standalone, enterprise or activity was born out of a practice in journalism. And that was a step that was really core and fundamental to journalism, which was ensuring that not just while you're reporting and researching, you're verifying the facts, but that after the fact, you have someone who's removed from the story to comb through it and to verify every single statement of fact before publication. When we look at how this has been sort of removed from the journalistic process and is now standalone, fact checkers seem to straddle two very distinct worlds. We sometimes, and for different organizations, they'll lean more into the other. Some of them are firmly in one or the other, but the first one is the practice of journalism. And you see that a lot of fact checkers will refer to the people who work with them as journalists. We don't at Africa Check, we call our staff researchers. But when it comes to sort of a journalistic assessment of impact or success, one of the easiest metrics to use is, unique views. How many people are reading your content? And it's a really easy thing to do that most fact-checking organizations report on because it's a widely understood and accepted metric. So hundreds of thousands, millions of people saw this report. Great, we can measure that and we can see if we're improving or we're declining over time. But anyone here will know that eyes on a page is not actually a metric of success because we don't know if we're having any real world impact. So the other, side or, sector that we have a foot in is sort of an advocacy sector. We want to create change. We want to advocate for something. And there is a bit of reluctance in the fact-checking world to use the word advocacy because we present ourselves as non-partisan, we're objective, we don't take sides. But it's advocacy for accurate information, for evidence-based decisions. And in that way, it is often very much in the theme of advocacy of holding people to account when they make false statements. Identifying a politician in your country who is repeatedly claiming something that is false and working over time, either with them in a carrot fashion, or sometimes against them with a stick, and repeatedly publishing things, repeatedly pointing out that they're getting it wrong, to over time hopefully get them to stop making that statement. Whether you were the only thing that led to that happening can be hard to determine, but you have to be quite creative often in this world to gauge success. And I think later one of the things we can talk about is some of the randomized control trials we're doing to measure if we are actually resulting in belief and behavior change on different platforms.
Yes, okay, nice to see you, right? It's good to have you on the program. So I wondered if you were to think of information wars, at least partly as kind of a battle around persuasion. So it's not just the information, it's about persuasion. And I would imagine that, Africa Check is not immune to that, right? So I guess I'd be curious as to how you persuade people of the reliability of the information you put out. I think partly because in terms of your funding model, people might suggest that at least some of your donors are left-leaning. So can you talk us through the investments you make in not only fact-checking information, but persuading people of the reliability of Africa Check and organizations like you?
Yeah, so I think that it's, when you're on the inside of something, it's very easy to drink the Kool-Aid that you follow an objective process and you take the same methodology for every claim that you fact check and you hold it to the same standards and you publish it in the same way. And all of those things could be true. But if the perception of your work is something else, it doesn't matter that you're objective and nonpartisan because no one is going to accept your work as accurate or truthful. So there's a lot of very conscious decisions and thinking that goes into the work that we do. And I think that the one easiest place to critique and probably where critiques of fact checking are most legitimate are critiques of what claims fact checkers select to fact check. You could have the most perfect, objective, nonpartisan, you can't punch a hole in it fact checking process. But if you are repeatedly selecting claims to fact check on one side of an argument that are false and publishing that, you are taking a side in an argument or in a debate because you are deciding to repeatedly show one side of something to be false. I think we need to be careful. There are certain settled debates You know, when it comes to, for example, certain healthcare treatments, like we have general consensus around the world that certain healthcare treatments are safe. And if you fact check the other side of that argument, you are most likely in all, if you know, not many cases, going to find them to be false. But you do have to take extra care, and you really do need to think very carefully about the claims that you fact check. It has often happened that, you know, we have fact checked someone, you know, a political fact check looking at a statement by a politician, and we found them to be false. And just a couple of weeks later, they make another really important, impactful statement that, you know, objectively, we should fact check, and we do, and we find it to be false. But we need to think about how we then release that content. It'll probably be better received if maybe we hold it for a little bit and we find a statement that is equally important on the other side of the debate to fact check, and then we can present those two fact checks together. So very conscious decision making, looking not just at a moment in time, but the history of the work that you've been doing, understanding that you're never going to make everyone happy. You know, if you publish a fact check, there's always going to be someone on one side of the spectrum who supports the person you're fact checking who's not going to be happy. And really laying out how you fact check, why you fact check, the history of how you fact check this person, and giving people the broader context of the work so it's not seen as a standalone effort.
Thanks, Kate. In our field, we have a very limited scope audit. We have specific information that we're providing and then limited scope on audit. In your area, it's almost unlimited, the amount of information you could potentially fact check. Can you talk a little bit about how do you decide what data, what information you're going to go for and start working through? How do you contain scope? What are the limitations of your work as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna write that down because I just want to address the first thing you said about scope, because I think that's also a really important point. Often when people join Africa Check, sometimes we get journalists, sometimes we get graduate students, and it can take quite a long time to train people to understand what we're looking at. So, you know, someone will start fact checking and it'll maybe be about, a claim will be about how much money was wastefully spent on an infrastructure project, or how much was lost to corruption. And, you know, we can check that with, you know, budget documents, audit documents. But there'll be this desire to go off into the political side and the motives and the allegations. And we have to constantly be bringing our researchers back on point that is not our scope. You know, we look at statements of fact, statements which make an assertion that can be verified. And we don't, you know, we keep our eyes on that target. We're not looking at the political motives, the agendas, the daggers, the skeletons in the closet. And some people criticize us for that because it can be obvious that there is a lot happening behind the scenes that we're not addressing. But our strongest, you know, what we can add to society and to public debate is evidence-based information. And by staying out of those more political investigations or debates, we strengthen our position. So back to your question about what information do we use, you know, when it comes to auditing, you have quite a narrow scope. We obviously cover a much wider range of topics. You know, I've mentioned political fact checking. We do education, health, infrastructure, trade. I once fact checked if there are more cows than people in Botswana. Like, there's nothing that we haven't touched. But we always follow the same process. And with the data side, though, we really try to be expert-led. So very few, I'd say none of the researchers who work for Africa Check are subject specialists. They haven't studied economics or health. They don't have degrees in education. But what they have are very inquisitive, curious, analytical minds. And that's what we hire people for. We want people who keep asking why, how was this gathered? Why did you gather it? Who gathered it? Once you cover a certain beat for a while, like I've done with education and crime, if someone makes a statement about the crime rate in South Africa or the murder rate, I know where to get that data. I don't need to speak to an expert to start with, although I'll probably end up with them for context. But we largely have scoped the data landscape in the countries that we work. We know what data is available. We know what data is respected and considered legitimate. The difficulty comes in where you may, for example, be fact-checking a claim about unemployment in Zimbabwe. And it's impossible to fact-check a claim about unemployment in Zimbabwe without using national data, or at least mentioning it. And often in fact-checking, you require an approach which is to triangulate the information that you have. You may have in-country, or let's talk about literacy in Zimbabwe, because it's often claimed that Zimbabwe has the highest literacy rates in Africa. If you look at their in-country data, it does suggest they have extremely high literacy rates, but that's because the bar that they use is much lower than the bar that international organizations will use. So we will say in-house, in country, this is what Zimbabwe says its literacy rate is. But if you look at how the data has been modeled and standardized by international organizations, you'll see that it actually ranks much lower. So it's about taking different data points, first of all, understanding and investigating their weaknesses, speaking to experts to help get that context, and then putting it all on the table. And if you have a data point that's an outlier, not ignoring it, not just conveniently saying, well, I'm not going to mention it because it makes my story 300 words longer and I have to explain why this is so much of an outlier, but taking the time to explain it, because if you ignore something and decide not to include it, someone will find it and they will either tweet you or email you or make a big scene, and it's a lot harder to then explain why you didn't include something.
Thank you. I'm really kind of intrigued by, the scope and the breadth of the work that you're doing. And I wonder, are there certain topics or areas where you find fact-checking is more effective or more persuasive than others, kind of setting aside the fact that you don't look at motivation and kind of the political side of things?
Yeah, so this is a bit of an obscure example, but I think it is one of the struggles that we have. And that is that it is easier, not easy, but it is easier to explain that something is wrong or to explain that you shouldn't believe something if you have evidence which contradicts it. So if someone says, the city of Johannesburg built 1,000 houses in a certain district, and we have data from national government, which is largely considered to be trustworthy, and it shows they only built 200, we can say that's wrong. It's not 1,000, it's 200. But if you have a claim where there is an information void and someone has taken advantage of the fact that we don't have data on something and they have made a statement, you can explain for pages and pages that this statement can't be verified. We can't say it's true or false because we don't have the data. But that just really isn't a convincing argument to people who really believe that or are inclined to believe that the person sharing that information is true. And I think that those information voids are often taken advantage, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, by bad actors who want to mislead and who want to be able to make use a topic for their ends, knowing that no one can actually refute them because there isn't data on it. And the answer of we don't know if that's true or not, you shouldn't say that, isn't a very compelling one.
Thanks, Kate. I'm wondering if we could move away from Africa just momentarily to Europe. And of course, a situation we're all familiar with and distressed by, which is of course the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Assuming it's true that Russia's clamped down significantly on social media sites, and actively controls its own media to perpetuate what it wants people to believe. As a fact-checking organization, how do you get in? What are the ways you might be able to reach people and push back against claims that you find out are false, either accidentally or more likely deliberately? And given how much you rely on social media, what options do you have available to you to try and get under the skin and do your work in that type of environment?
Yeah, so I think you've really hit on probably what is one of the greatest weaknesses of current fact-checking organizations is our reliance on a distribution platform that is also the way that false information is distributed and is also so easily switched off. And we have faced, those events in a number of African countries. And we need to do better. I think that if we look at how FactCheck functions, we are completely, if not all, online based. We publish on our website, we distribute via email, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we distribute on WhatsApp. If the South African government decided to turn the lights off, we'd pretty much be tickets. That would be it. I think, though, that this is kind of where we can lean more into the advocacy side of the work that we do. And we have just recently hired someone to operate as a sort of outreach coordinator in our organization. And that is a role which will look largely at mobilizing grassroots organizations and communities to, first of all, understand the challenges that they're facing, because I think I know what the big debates are in the metros in South Africa. I know what people are fighting about on Twitter, what's in the headlines in the big cities, but we have a very limited understanding of what is contested and what dangerous information is being shared in rural or out of reach communities. So looking to partner with organizations on the ground, whether it's in health or education, to help us understand the misinformation challenges that they're facing, and then come up with programs, whether it's training, information sessions, to help and put information and skills into those communities. So that is one of the ways that we're trying to sort of resolve that issue, but it's still very much in its early stages. Another thing that we're doing is looking to partner with what we're calling fact ambassadors, so people who are nominated in communities for sharing accurate information, pushing back against false narratives, to train them, give them information that they can distribute. But then again, that largely relies on them having access to the internet. So I think a challenge for most fact-checking organizations, and one that we don't really have a solution for at the moment.
Thanks, Kate. On a related question, so a lot of these institutions that are perpetuating lies are profiteering from them. And I have a colleague working on that, and then you become a threat to them. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with the fact that they might view you as a threat and they might act aggressively towards you and your institution?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, when it comes to profiteering, it can be quite hard for us to determine in what cases people are sharing false information because they're trying to make money from it, as opposed to people who are just sharing false information because they don't have any bad intentions, but they found something and they want to pass it on. So again, that is where our scope sort of ends. We rely on other colleagues who work in the sector to often try to dig into the motives and the networks. But when it comes to for-profit false information, one of the biggest areas that we've tackled are job scams. In South Africa, we have, I think it would be correct to say, the highest unemployment rate in the world. We have millions of unemployed people with very low prospects of ever finding employment, and they are targeted and exploited and taken advantage of on a daily basis by people who are either trying to steal their money or scam them. And we've also heard stories, but are yet to confirm them, of these scams being used for human trafficking. So we shut down those sort of scams on a daily basis. Through our work with Facebook, we downrank those posts. We've had those pages shut down. We've never really had any serious pushback of that sort. Either we haven't poked a bear that bites, or we aren't seen as that sort of threatening to the work that they do. But there have actually been other topics where we've never really had a serious threat or someone really pose a threat to our organization or our personal safety. But there have been topics where we have had just enormous pushback that has felt on the cusp of a serious threat. So I think it just depends really on understanding the landscape, understanding who you're taking on, but also not allowing that to really limit the work that you do too much, because if you pull back from those challenges, then you're really retreating from the space where people need you most.
So I thought we could hit the audience questions, and I'm going to encourage the audience to kind of pipe in some more questions. We have one that says, I understand that WhatsApp is a big vector of dis and misinformation in parts of South America and Asia, because online media there is usually behind a paywall and people get news from their WhatsApp contacts sharing screenshots. Do you see that in Africa as well? And what do you think Mark Zuckerberg what would you ask Mark Zuckerberg to do to reduce the velocity of disinformation on a closed messaging platform like WhatsApp?
Yeah, so we do see that. WhatsApp is an enormous platform and place where false information is shared. And because of its encrypted nature, we really have no idea the scale of the information that is being shared. In 2019, we came up with a project with a podcasting company called Volume in Johannesburg, South Africa. And what we wanted to explore was if we could do fact checking on WhatsApp that wasn't just mass mailing or using broadcast lists to send people links to fact checks that have been done. Because we know from our experience on other platforms that if you're going to be posting on TikTok, you need to create content for TikTok. And that is, short, funny videos with music. If you're going to be posting content on WhatsApp, one of the most successful and popular formats on WhatsApp is a voice note, because it's easy to send, it has personality, you can listen to it while you're doing other stuff. So podcasting penetration is quite low in many African countries, including South Africa. So we thought we could use the voice note feature to essentially distribute a 5 to 7 minute long podcast. And we would also use the platform to gather false information. So we put out a tweet about our idea for this. I tend to approach these sort of projects as, if you have an idea, you just tell people you want to do it and you just roll with it and you keep improving and innovating. But we didn't know that we'd put out a tweet and within like 24 hours, we'd have like thousands of people who are messaging us, like TV, news, radio, everyone loved the idea. And we then had to make it happen. And we now have around 5,000 subscribers in South Africa, with many more in country in Nigeria and Kenya. So we gather information on WhatsApp. If people receive if they receive a message that they suspect is false on WhatsApp, they have our number saved. They don't need to screenshot it or save it, go to Gmail, email us. They don't need to send it to us on Facebook. They just hold down on the message, they forward it to us. We have someone who mans that phone, and every day they're logging, they are cataloging, we're deciding what we're going to fact check. And then twice a week in South Africa, we produce a very short voice note where we fact check the most popular message that we were sent and the most dangerous. And we send it back via voice note. So it has been quite successful. We have stayed on the business app. We have been given the opportunity to try an API, a more automated system with the support of WhatsApp, but it just didn't work for us, mainly because one of the limitations of the API is that you can't mass mail people. They really restrict users' ability to send out content to their users. And we just don't believe that users are likely to request information on a frequent basis from a fact-checking organization. Most users just want once a week for us to tell you what's false. So we've stuck with the business app. But the question is, what impact are we having? And that is a big question with a lot of fact checking, because you can publish an amazing fact check, the president got something wrong, there's irrefutable evidence, so what? Is he going to stop saying what he's been saying? Are his speechwriters going to write something different? You have very limited control over that. So we have partnered with a sort of research group with researchers from a number of different universities. And for the past more than a year now, we've been conducting a randomized control trial with 10,000 participants, where we have been distributing this content to them, but also in different variations, because we're trying to figure out, is text better than audio? Is short audio better than long audio? If we appeal to them empathetically, and we acknowledge why they may believe something false. Are they more likely to accept a fact check? And we're now reaching the end of that intervention. So hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months, we'll have some idea about the impact of belief and behavior change on the platform through distributing content. So I think that's really exciting because, if it's what we're doing is working, that's great. Let's use that research to get more funding and really scale this. If we're not having an impact, it's also good to know that, because we need to pivot elsewhere and we need to try find an intervention that actually works.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to think about the different methods of delivery when you're trying to kind of present a fact check to people. And a lot of what I've read also has to do with kind of the messenger themselves, who's the person who's presenting this information. So I wonder, in your advocacy work, how do you try to leverage, the power of the social networks of people that are, subscribers of yours and readers of yours to deliver that information? And maybe as a follow-on to that, how can people who are listening today, work to fight disinformation in their networks?
So I think that traditionally in the early stages of Africa Check, and even until quite recently, we relied on virality or shares on platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. We would just see people sharing as the function on the platform allows. But what we have noticed recently is that peer-to-peer sharing on a platform like WhatsApp is incredibly powerful. And one of the reasons that we believe it is, and again, we haven't tested this, but it's just something that I suspect, is that, actually, it's the cause of why I think false information can go so viral and be so damaging on WhatsApp. And it's because it is a message, a direct message between two people who know each other with no audience. If someone sends you a message warning you about a vaccine or about a crime tactic, which is apparently happening in Johannesburg, if it's your aunt, if it's your mom or it's your sister, your relationship to that information and how you react to it is influenced by your relationship with the person who sent it to you. And your level of trust and how you receive something is influenced by that relationship. So increasingly, we are looking to, help people, empower people to share content on the platform. So when it comes to WhatsApp, actually having prompting messages, when we share them a link or an image or a graphic, we'll say, please drop this into your local WhatsApp group. And again, we have very little analytics because there's no way to track how that was shared or who it was shared to. That's something that we're increasingly relying on. You had a second question that I can't remember.
I was wondering, along those same lines, what people who are listening today might be able to do to kind of take action in their own lives.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, we published a Fact Checkers Guide to Family Gatherings, because I think that we all, even before COVID, we all have people in our lives, whether they're friends or families, who just infuriate us because they are so susceptible to false information and they will believe anything. And I think that dealing with those people is actually harder than dealing with strangers on the internet, because it's very hard to remove emotion from it and to engage civilly and not throw a plate of potatoes across the table at them. So I think we actually tweeted a few things last week on this topic. And the first thing I would advise is, if you are engaging with people who maybe you even love them, and they are sharing false information and you think they're wrong, I think the first thing to do is you need to check that you're right. Because often people who feel very strongly about fighting false information, about accuracy, they are not immune to getting things wrong. So before you accuse someone of being an idiot or having their facts wrong, refrain, maybe excuse yourself, go to the bathroom, check that you're actually right before you take that step, and get the facts in order so that you can cite the numbers, where they come from, who collected them. I think a second thing that is useful, and this is actually one of the variables that we're testing in our randomized control trial on WhatsApp, is to enter a conversation like this with empathy. To acknowledge why someone may have believed something. What is the emotion that false information is resonating with inside of them, Is it fear? Is it anger? Are they scared? And trying to say, you know, I can see why you would be worried about this, or you might believe this, because, you know, getting an injection can be really scary, and, you know, you're not really sure how it was, you know, the vaccine was developed, or who made it, or what's in it, but I can show you. And just acknowledging that very human emotion, because facts are not going to override emotion at that stage. You need to acknowledge that emotion, and that person needs to see that you aren't dismissing what feels like very legitimate feelings. So get your facts right, acknowledge the emotion, keep things very simple. It can be, and I think, you know, it can be very hard for people who work in research and academia, because we read and we tend to talk in jargon all the time. But for most people in the world, you know, we speak very simply and very plainly, and we don't understand cohorts or randomized control trials or confidence intervals. And you need to really take time to break down these very complex terms so that they can be understood. And that's actually a lot of the work that we do with our copy editors, who we employ to edit all of our work, to just strip out all the jargon. And then I think once you've done your best, you know, accepting that you're not going to convince everyone, and that you may have to decide to just be happy and have a good relationship with someone rather than being right. Or you may have to decide that you can't have a relationship with someone because they're just so far down the rabbit hole. And I think that, you know, information, false information, disinformation has really become like a fracture line in communities and families and institutions. And we do need to reach across that chasm and try and reach the other side and pull them over. But some people are goners, and you have to decide how much effort you're going to put into it.
Thank you, Kate. I just wondered if we might come back to something you talked about a little bit before, which is sort of you deciding what to fact check and how and when. And I think the argument that you raised earlier on is the importance of being seen to be balanced, you know, as part of you persuading the public that you are who you say you are, in a relatively neutral position. I wonder, do you ever have something like editorial meetings where you might decide to self-censor and not fact check because either, you know, the consequences might be severe, where, you know, an organization, as Ellen alluded to, or a politician might try and fight you on this or make life unpleasant, or more likely, whether you might worry occasionally that fact-checking might exacerbate an already very fragile situation and, for example, fuel vigilante action. And you know, I know that South Africa is not immune to vigilantes, and so is that something you bear in mind? So you don't just fact-check, but you think very carefully as an editorial team through the consequences of the fact-checking, and maybe sometimes decide to self-censor or not check.
So to your first question about whether we would ever pull back or self-censor because we would be worried about a backlash, I can say that in the almost 9 years that I've worked at Africa Check, I cannot think of an instance when we have done that. Of course, it's impossible for, you know, anyone here to check that because you weren't in our editorial meetings, but those sort of consequences would inform how we would deal with that fact check. So if we were fact checking a statement by someone very powerful, a president, a politician, and we were finding them to be wrong, we would do that research. We would widen the number of experts that we speak to so that we have not one expert, not two experts, maybe 3 or 4 from different sides of the political spectrum, all confirming the same thing. And then once we have reached our conclusion, we would probably take the extra step to first reach out to the person that we're fact checking to inform them of our findings and to give them the opportunity to comment. And we would give them the opportunity so that we could include their comment in the report. And that then allows us an opportunity to engage with the focus of the fact check before the publication so that we can gauge the reaction. And it also lends a lot more credibility to the work if you publish it with a response. Sometimes you don't get a response, but that is something that we would do. I think the question of whether we would self-censor to prevent potential harm, even if our fact check was solid and we found something to be right or wrong. I can't think of an example. Maybe an example, you mentioned vigilantism. So we often in South Africa have regular bouts of xenophobic violence, where migrants and migrant businesses are targeted. And some people may be aware of incredibly horrific scenes that we have seen over the years of people being killed, set on fire. And it is sort of seasonal, like you can bet money on it. And a year or two, every 2 years, there will be an outbreak and people will be killed. A lot of the fact checking that we have done of claims around the number of migrants, the role that they play in the economy, we found those statements to be unsubstantiated, inflated, completely wrong. I can imagine a scenario though, where we were fact checking a claim by a person who is known to be xenophobic. Like right now we have an operation, a movement in the country, which is going into townships, forcing their ways into buildings, checking people's papers, evicting people who are foreigners. They have no legitimacy. They're not the police. They're just an independent civil movement. If we fact checked one of their claims and we found it to be right, there would probably be quite a big decision about how we would share that information. And we would take a measure of the temperature at the moment and think about how we would distribute it, how we would communicate it. My instinct is that we would still run it in some capacity, but we would need to think about what impact our role would have in that. We haven't had to make those sorts of decisions with the topic of migration, but it's something that would be at the front of our mind. I think a related but somewhat different example is if we think back to the early days of the pandemic, where the media and fact checkers reported statements about the efficacy of masks from experts in a time where we were being told that masks don't work, that you don't need to use them, etc. And it later came out that a lot of that messaging was because they didn't want to rush on masks and they wanted them to be reserved for healthcare workers. And I think that poses a different challenge for the media and for fact checkers, because in that moment and in that time, there was no other information about the efficacy of masks. We just had to rely on the scientific community and actually on government and policy advisors. And I think that, in that role, fact checkers and the media probably did the best of what they could do, which was to speak to experts, which was to convey that. And in that extent, really, I think the scientific community somewhat let down the public and the media with not being upfront about the fact that, masks do work, they do have a role to play in this pandemic, but we really just don't want the public to buy all of them at the moment. So instead of being honest about something and about what we knew, an alternative story was found to try to compel people to do something that the scientific community wanted them to do. And I think that in those sort of instances, there can be a huge loss of trust and damage can be done to the relationship between the media, fact checkers, the public, and the scientific community. And that's something we need to be really aware of.
Thanks, Kate. I'm very sensitive to the rapid nature and the viral nature of social media. And we kind of touched on it earlier, but I wanted to revisit. What do you think the responsibility is of Twitter, Facebook, Zuckerberg, people like that with respect to this? And are they responsive to you? And can they self-police?
So, full disclosure, Africa Check is a partner of Facebook. We are part of their third-party fact-checking program. So we are paid by the platform to fact-check content. And what that looks like is we have access to an interface from Facebook where they have an algorithm, and they also rely on reports from users where potentially false information is flagged. Our researchers can peruse that list and they can choose something to fact check. They can also find stuff independently on Facebook and choose to fact check it. And if they find that it is false, we write a fact check, we rate that content, and the traditional or the normal response from Facebook is that they down rank that content. Most content, if not all content, is not removed because Facebook current policy is not to remove false information unless it violates their community standards. But what happens is that the spread of that information is greatly reduced and fewer people will see it. Also, if you engage with that content, you will see a fact check appended to it. And if you try to share a URL that we have fact checked, you will be warned before posting it that a fact checker has found it to be false. So I think that when it comes to platforms like Facebook, Facebook really does see fact checkers and the fact checking community as playing a big role in dealing with false information on the platform. I think the obvious problem is that there will never be enough fact checkers to do that. And, you know, you could have an army of fact checkers, a sweatshop of fact checkers, you know, working 24 hours a day trying to fact check content. And because of the nature of false information, the platforms, the algorithms, the way that people are primed to respond to emotive messaging, especially when it's false, it's going to be very difficult for this approach to solve the problem. But this program does provide to fact checkers a very real way to have an impact. So last year, one of my team members fact checked I won't say medicine because it's not medicine. They fact checked a company that was selling tablets, and they had a very emotive video where they had all these people in South Africa saying that they had been cured from COVID, they had been brought back from death from these tablets, and the video had been viewed over 1 million times. We looked at the ingredients, we spoke to chemists, and they were like, no, you should not take those tablets. That's like a chemical cleaning ingredient that, yes, it's going to fizz when it hits your stomach and release oxygen, but that's because it's a dangerous chemical. And we fact checked that. We found it to, you know, be dangerous health misinformation. We rated it. If you try and watch that video, it will tell you that it's false. And anyone who engages with that video will hear that it's false, but that video is still on Facebook. So it's, you know, there's a bit of sort of an interplay between two different groups, you know, one being fact checkers who want to make sure that, you know, there isn't false information online, with the other, you know, player in this engagement being a platform who wants to support freedom of speech, which wants people to think that they're not going to have their content removed. So it's an engagement, it's a back and forth. Facebook also doesn't allow fact checkers to fact check and downrank political speech. So even if a politician, you know, we had a few presidents in Africa tell people they could cure COVID by steaming, you know, if they posted that, Facebook won't downrank that content because it's from a president. And so it's difficult to, you know, justify downranking, you know, a normal person who's sharing false information, yes, let's downrank them, but a president, no, we won't touch them. And it, you know, it's a discussion and a debate that's ongoing.
I wonder if maybe you could talk more about the kind of both the practical and the ethical dimensions of disinformation in the political sphere. That's something in America we certainly have some experience with. And how do you think about those conversations where maybe motivation is more important, but maybe outside the domain of fact checkers themselves?
Some people have criticized the work that we've done on certain topics because we've been accused of ignoring what many or some would see as overt actions with motivations to mislead. Alan, you used the word lies earlier. We would never use the word lies, mainly because it opens us up for defamation and legal lawsuits. Because, you know, the word lie has a very strict legal definition. You need to have knowledge that the information that you're sharing is false. You have to share it with the intention to mislead. We would never use the L word, although a lot of our supporters and followers do. We speak about the accuracy of people's statements because in most of the work that we do, we can be almost 100% sure whether our findings, if something is true or false. You know, one area that is very contentious in South Africa, and it's a bit of a niche topic, so it may not resonate with you or with your audience, but is the topic of what are called farm murders and attacks in South Africa. And it is a phenomenon where, you know, it is characterized as largely white farmers and white people living in rural areas in the country are targeted, and they are attacked and murdered, often in very horrific ways, often in ways that include torture, sometimes with goods, cash, guns being stolen, other times with apparently nothing being stolen. And there are two polar opposite viewpoints on this. The one being that these attacks and murders are racially motivated, and that they are attacks by Black people who may be funded by the government or by third forces to drive white people off arable land in the country, to claim back land, to destabilize the white population. That is the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that these are criminal attacks that are just like any other crime which is committed in our country, horrific and unacceptable, but that these people aren't being targeted because they're white or they're farmers, they're just being targeted because crime happens everywhere and they're rural. In this debate, a lot of statistics are thrown around. Commonly is a claim around the murder rate of white farmers, with some people claiming that, you know, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to be murdered if you're a white farmer than if you're a policeman in South Africa. And these sort of statements are incredibly powerful and resonate with different bases. When we fact check these statements, we completely detach ourselves from the motives, the history, and sometimes even the context of the person who has made it. Not because that isn't important, but because we risk alienating people who we could convince if we lean either way in our description or investigation of that motive. You know, there's some organizations who share these statistics, and certain sectors would describe them, maybe say they're racist, they're minority groups organization, they're, you know, there could be a whole lot of descriptors used, but we stick very narrowly. They're a non-governmental organization with so many followers that was established in this year, not because that context isn't important, but because if you are someone who may support that organization, and we fact check one of their claims and we find it to be wrong, if our language is neutral, if it is based on the facts without any lens applied to it, we're more likely to convince a supporter of that organization that's, you know, they said something wrong and this is why, and here are the facts. I don't think that our approach is free from critique, and I think there are many people who would disagree with us, and I think that some of that criticism may be legitimate. But the moment we lean either way and start to pass judgment, we will alienate people. And we would rather stand in the very boring straight row, which is just the facts and the fact checking, than step out of that line.
Okay, it's a very quick one for me. Have you ever been wrong? And what did you do?
Yeah, we have been wrong. We used to say for a number of years, you know, we've had to make corrections, but we've never had to change a verdict. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think we have had to, over the last couple of years, we have changed a verdict. And that means maybe we said something was incorrect and it was correct, or we said it was misleading and it was incorrect. So I think the first thing to say about being wrong is that we are not immune. And I think that's a really important message. We need very strong messaging about getting things wrong, because if you are going to be looking at statements that people make and you're going to be doing the work declaring they are wrong and hoping that they're correct, you need to hold that same statement, same standard to yourself. And a lot of the people that we fact check, even politicians, sometimes I do believe they just make honest mistakes. Sometimes they're not very good at research, or they just copied and pasted something from a news story and they put it in their speech. You know, there are often very innocent mistakes where people aren't trying to mislead. They just aren't doing the work that they should be doing and they're negligent. So we are a member of the International Fact-Checking Network, and we have to adhere to a number of their principles, and one is a policy of honest and open corrections. So when we get something wrong, what happens is that, first of all, we always make sure to engage with anyone who has told us we've got it wrong. Civilly, really openly, honestly, we thank them. We say we'll look into it when we include them in any process that we go through. once we realize we've got something wrong, we tend to go through another process of revisiting the fact check. When we find the conclusion that we should have reached, we'll double check it with another expert. And then we have to go through what can sometimes be a bit of a painful process, but it's necessary, of being very public and open about that correction. So we will say something on our website. But if we initially distributed that fact check on Twitter, on Facebook, via an email newsletter, on WhatsApp, we're committed to then issuing that correction on each of those platforms. And we always add a note to any report that we update. So we don't do any stealthy corrections without a note. In my experience, when you have to put out communication like that about a correction, your mind always goes to the worst place. You're going to get piled on, you're going to be eviscerated. In most cases, people don't, there's hardly ever a reaction. And most of the reactions that we get are, thank you so much. It means a lot that you've corrected, and it makes me trust your work more. And I think a lot of that is that we aren't vindictive, and we don't personalize our fact checks. We don't call people, we don't say people lied. We don't say, people are bad actors. We don't say that, they're trying to mislead and they have an agenda. We're just saying something is true or false. And if we make a mistake because we missed something, we correct. A more difficult situation, and not one that I can think of a recent example, is where you complete a fact check with available evidence that is in the public domain. And after publication, new evidence comes to light that may change your verdict. But then it's a bit of it's a bit tricky, because we fact check claims that are made on the evidence that was available at the time. So if someone made a statement and we found it to be false, but subsequently there's information that they didn't have either, which showed that it was true, it's tricky. Their statement was false at the time because there was no evidence, but then subsequently it turned out that it was true. So there you have to do a bit of nuance updating, showing that subsequently it was true, but at the time they actually didn't have any information to support it. So they may just have been lucky or knew something that we didn't.
So Kate, my last question, and I appreciate all of your time and everybody who's participated. You've got an audience here of business school professors, students, alumni, and when we first spoke, you had suggested that we might be able to support some of your work. Is there something that we could collectively help you with?
I think that one area for fact checking that is doesn't receive as much attention as it probably should is around budgeting and spending at government level. And this can be because it's very confusing, even for a journalist who works in the financial space. It can be difficult to know where to find budget information, how to understand it, how to separate multi-year budget allocations from single year, how money is rolled over, how it is ring-fenced. And one of the, apart from just the understanding, the skills and the expertise that we lack is spotting things that don't sound right. And a lot of the work that I've done at Africa Check is developing relationships with experts who maybe helped me on a health check. I spoke to a doctor, or I spoke to someone who works in education. And when I thank them for their assistance, I'll always say, let me know if you see something that you think should be fact checked. And I think that experts, whether it's in auditing or business, can really play such a great role to just keep an eye on debates. If someone tweets something and if you look at it and you're like, that doesn't sound right, just forwarding it to a fact checker, submitting it anonymously on a fact checker's website and saying, I don't think this is right. You should look at this document. You don't need to hold their hand. You don't need to do the fact check for them, but just like putting a flag up and saying someone should look at this can be really helpful, because we can't fact check what we don't know is important. And we could look at a statement and say, I don't know whether that sounds true or false, but having worked on education and crime in South Africa for the last 9 years, I can look at a statement and I can say it doesn't smell good. And I can know whether I should spend my time fact checking it.
Sounds like an MBA group project to me. So I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the audience participating. I can speak for myself. I think what you're doing is heroic. I think we need more of it. And so I really appreciate getting that perspective. Our next session, I'm going to share screen for a minute. For those of you, if you can see this, will be with Matt Gorham, who's a senior fellow Cyber and Privacy Innovation Institute with PwC in the United States, who's going to join for a moderated discussion about coordinated disinformation campaigns to disrupt or exploit business operations, reputations, and markets. And so we're going to have the business risk around disinformation. That will be the 28th of April at 7 p.m. London time. So we hope that you join us there. Again, I want to thank you, Kate, for joining us. Thank you, audience, for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And Kate, I know you're available on LinkedIn and Africa Check's website. That's how I found you. Any other ways that we can contact you?
Yeah, I just dropped my email in the chat. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. You can follow Africa Check on Twitter at Africa Check. I'm also on Twitter at Kate Omega. And yeah, this is really great. And I look forward to the discussion on the 28th.
And one of these days we'll invite you out to Cambridge.
Oh,
So, and thanks, Mark and John, for joining and helping facilitate the discussion. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.